I'm thinking about this transcendent knowledge stuff again, or whether we want to call it transcendent information or something like that. But just basically the idea that that some kind of facts about the world, or data, or information, or knowledge about the world can exist outside of human engagement, outside of human knowing. Whether there are certain facts which precede, or, as I say, just kind of exceed, or don't rely upon the human engagement. What I said in the last couple of videos, I think, is, there's some terminological things, certainly for me, knowledge, and to a lesser extent data and information, kind of contain within themselves a relationship between a human knower and some notional transcendent object of that knowledge. But I think there are, if you like, prototypical, for me at least, there are kind of prototypical examples of objects of knowledge which do appear more transcendent than others. Like, for example, in the last one I was talking about the difference between social facts and facts which appear more universal. Social facts to do with synthetic truths about how the social world operates, which it would be absurd to think having a kind of ubiquitous status, or which precede human involvement. But other facts certainly do, and I'm just trying to wrap my head around what the relationship to something like universal laws, like the laws of physics, for example, what their relationship between those are to human knowing, I suppose. Because for me, those are absolutely the archetypal forms of knowledge, which it seems absurd not to consider as transcendent. Clearly, the universe has been around for a long time, whatever it is, 13.7 billion years or something, and humans have only been around for like a fingernail's length of that. So given that, there must have been a lot of stuff happening prior to humans. It happened somehow. It seemed to happen in an orderly fashion, given the complex and evolved status of the universe around us. So it seems logical that that those things that we now think of as universal laws and the laws of physics obviously preceded our knowing of them. It just seems completely common sense. And in that sense, we as humans are kind of discovering the stuff that's always been there. We're discovering the laws of gravity. We're discovering, I don't know much about physics, but we're discovering these various cosmological laws as we go along, in the same way that you would discover the contours of an unexplored continent. You're kind of going back in time and visiting and finding these objects of knowledge, these physical laws, and they absolutely precede our arrival and transcend any kind of knowledge that we have. At least that's the idea, and I can't, in any meaningful sense, doubt that. But I'm just trying to think into it a little bit and complexify it for myself, really. So what I'm thinking of here, just as a kind of an analogy, really, is I'm thinking of, this is really prompted by the book by Edwin Abbott called Flatland, which is available free online, which is a brilliant book. It's written about 100 years ago. It's quite short, and it's just an account of what life is like in a two-dimensional world. It's the story of a three-dimensional character, a three-dimensional figure, who visits a two-dimensional world and meets the inhabitants there. And it's a complex kind of quasi-human environment with social structures and political structures and all that kind of, all the paraphernalia of lived human experience, but lived on a two-dimensional plane. And all the characters on it are platonic shapes, so it's triangles and hexagons and squares, rectangles. And it, as part of it, it goes into all the various implications of two-dimensionality. What kind of a political system could evolve in that environment? What kinds of biology would be necessary? And to a certain extent, what kind of physics would be operating? And I think it's in there. It gives this account of what the appearance of this three-dimensional character into this two-dimensional world is like. I'm saying I think it's a while since I read it. And if I remember rightly, it's imagined as a kind of, although from the perspective of the three-dimensional entity, it's almost like it's almost like a beach ball hitting a pond. That's kind of how I imagine it. So from the position of the three-dimensional entity, it's simply just progressing in a fairly conventional way onto a surface of a planar surface. But from the perspective of the inhabitants of that plane, the inhabitants of the surface of the pond, for example, if I was to use that analogy, it doesn't look like that at all, because they only have access to these two dimensions. As this kind of beach ball-shaped entity strikes the surface, it appears in their world as a very small point, and as the ball descends, it appears as a circle that expands like that. And then presumably if the ball was to continue going through the surface, or the entity was to drop through the two-dimensional world, that circle, which is their only representation in the two-dimensional environment, that circle would be seen to diminish to a point and then vanish as the ball or the entity dropped through the surface. And I think in Flatland, obviously, it's a unique experience. They don't get three-dimensional entities entering their two-dimensional world all the time. So this experience of this thing, which just kind of expands out into being, is a unique experience. But if it wasn't a unique experience, if things like that happened all the time, if three-dimensional entities kept entering this two-dimensional world, I'm guessing that what would happen is, after a while, they'd start to note consistencies in what was happening. They'd start to note that the speed of expansion of this circle, as the three-dimensional entity dropped onto the surface, the speed of expansion varied according to certain conditions, predictable and ascertainable conditions. You'd also be able to correlate perhaps the speed of the expansion with the kind of effects of that. Maybe there'd be ripples, or maybe there'd be damage done, or maybe there'd be the equivalent of shock waves or something like that spreading out from this sudden expansion. So there'd be correlations between that. They'd started to notice correlations between perhaps what in three-dimensional terms would be the angle at which the object enters this plane. So sometimes this expanding thing expands from a centre, and other times it expands in a different way from a moving centre, which would correlate, which would be derived from this incident angle of attack. Sometimes that if the object was rotating as it entered the surface, that would create a different expansion pattern on the surface of this two-dimensional environment, which again would be predictable. So what you could do, or at least what I'm imagining a two-dimensional scientist in this strange flatland could do, is start to understand the regularities that's happening in that, the two-dimensional regularities, and perhaps even start to be able to write equations and formulate laws about how this thing happened, about why it's like that, really. And probably make quite creative theories to do that. They'd be entirely two-dimensional theories. They'd be completely located in flatland. But nevertheless, they would be predictable, presumably. They'd be verifiable. You could do various experiments the next time one of these things came flying through. They would be completely robust theories eventually, and probably would be published in the equivalent of two-dimensional scientific journals. But what would be the status of these laws? What would the status of those things be? Would they truly be transcendent laws? What would their status be? Would it make any sense to say that the laws that's been formulated in Flatland preceded the creation of the universe, or preceded the development of those laws by human beings? Were those laws of two-dimensional physics just lying around waiting to be discovered, or were they absolutely a result of human engagement within a very particular interpretive framework, an interpretive framework that they're locked into because of their two-dimensional status in this case? I don't know. I haven't got an answer for that. I guess I'm just trying to think into this idea, because obviously that's the position we're in. We're three-dimensional beings. We can think in terms of higher dimensions, and I know people do. There are physical theories which use more dimensions, which use 11 dimensions or whatever. But I don't think just dimensionality is all there is to it, really. There must be other things apart from that. So whilst we are absolutely able to form theories which for us are completely transcendent, perhaps it's the case that these things are also partly a product of our interpretive framework, an interpretive framework which defines reality, if you like, defines objectivity, defines permanence, defines ubiquity, defines these ideas that we're thinking of as transcendent. I don't know. I don't want to say that there's any kind of cultural relativism here. I'm absolutely not saying that. But I'm not sure it's possible to think outside the box in that way.